Dean Martin was more than just an entertainer. He was the smooth voice behind Everybody Loves Somebody, the charming host of his own television show, and a movie star who lit up the silver screen. For decades, his easy smile and cool style made millions of fans believe he lived a perfect life. But behind the glamour was a man who faced deep pain, terrible loss, and struggles that would have broken most people. Early life and struggles. Born in 1917 in Steubenville, Ohio, Dean Martin started life as Dino Paul Crochet. His Italian parents had come to America with little more than hope and a language that made their young son feel like an outsider. At just 5 years old, Dino walked into classrooms where other children mocked his accent and made him feel different. School never felt like home to him, and this early rejection taught him that being different could be very lonely. To protect himself from cruel teasing, young Dino learned to use humor. He turned mean comments into jokes and found that making people laugh could soften their cruelty. This defense became the beginning of the entertainer he would become. Music also gave him comfort during these hard times. He found peace playing drums, beating away the hurt of being rejected and dreaming that music might one day take him far from the narrow world of Steubenville. By age 16, Dino had left school forever and walked through the gates of a steel mill. The work was brutal. Endless heat, choking dust, and backbreaking labor that felt like punishment. Each day was a test of how much pain he could endure, and each small paycheck was proof he could survive in a world that showed no mercy. When the mill work wasn't enough to pay the bills, Dino tried boxing as Kid Crochet, but the ring brought only defeats, broken noses, and shattered pride. Still, even in those brutal losses, he learned something important. How to get back up after being knocked down. These beatings taught him that pain could make a person stronger, and that scars could become badges of survival. When boxing failed to support him, the nighttime world welcomed Dino as a blackjack dealer in smoky clubs where danger lurked in every corner. He learned to read people's faces like cards, and discovered that charm could calm suspicious minds while a steady smile could become armor. In these dim clubs, he studied people the way others studied books. He perfected the timing of jokes, learned the rhythm of stories, and understood the quiet moment when a song touches someone's heart. It was tragic that so much of his elegance came from places that gave him little grace in return. But these dark experiences built the poise, timing, and quiet courage that would serve him throughout his life. The lonely boy who once sat silent in school became a young man who could hold a crowd's attention. The factory worker who endured endless hours without complaint became the fighter who rose after every fall, and the beginning entertainer who knew that a smile could welcome people while also protecting himself. The struggle for recognition. In the early 1940s, Dino stepped into the smoky world of nightclub entertainment, singing to crowds who barely looked up from their drinks. He borrowed the style of Perry Como, copying a voice that wasn't yet his own because he was desperate to be heard, but terrified he would always remain invisible. He called himself Dino Martini, thinking the name sounded elegant, but it only made prejudice worse. Audiences sneered at the Italian sound of it, and what little applause he earned slipped away like smoke, leaving him emptier than before. The shame of a name that marked him as an outsider forced him to give up another piece of his soul. Following advice from bandleader Sammy Watkins, he became Dean Martin, as if a new name could erase the old wound of being unwanted. But even with this new identity, cruel indifference followed him. When he tried to sing at a refined New York club, the room fell silent, not in wonder, but in merciless boredom. His smooth voice drifted into emptiness that offered nothing back. The silence was so devastating that he later said it hurt more than any punch he had taken in the boxing ring. At just 27 years old, he walked off that stage humiliated, carrying himself with practiced coolness, but secretly tormented by the thought that he might be doomed to remain a shadow in someone else's story. It's heartbreaking to imagine Dean Martin at that moment, young, handsome, with a voice that could melt hearts, yet treated as if he were nothing more than an extra in his own life. The partnership that changed everything. Destiny has a cruel way of hiding miracles inside disasters. In 1945, when Dean was 28, he met a wild 19-year-old comic named Jerry Lewis at New York's Glass Hat Club. Jerry was as hungry for recognition as Dean was, and just as reckless with energy. On that fateful night, Jerry burst into Dean's performance with crazy, unscripted jokes, a reckless interruption that seemed certain to destroy what little dignity Dean had left. For one terrible moment, it looked like humiliation would crush Dean again. But then the audience exploded in uncontrollable laughter. They weren't laughing at Dean's failure, but at the amazing collision of music and madness before them. That accident of desperation became pure magic. The smooth crooner and the manic clown discovered they could set a stage on fire in ways neither could achieve alone. Dean's effortless charm wrapped around Jay. Aries' chaos like perfect opposites fused into brilliance. Years later, Jerry would remember that Dean looked like he belonged even when no one else believed it. Dean himself would admit that this partnership was born not from planning, but from the ashes of despair turned inside out. From ridicule and rejection came one of the greatest duos in show business history, a miracle born from pain and humiliation that had nearly ended Dean's career. Success and hidden pain. By July 1946, Dean Martin stood beside Jerry Lewis at the 500 Club in Atlantic City, facing a crowd ready to see them fail. In desperation, they threw away their script. Dean sang with smooth defiance, while Jerry tore across the stage in wild chaos. What should have been disaster turned into miracle. The audience exploded with joy, and in that instant, a decade of glory was born. Together, they conquered the Copacabana, dominated NBC radio, turned the Colgate Comedy Hour into a weekly ritual, and filled theaters with hit after hit. By the early 1950s, they were America's hottest act, earning fortunes that seemed impossible. But while the world laughed, Dean quietly suffered. Critics worshipped Jerry as the genius while dismissing Dean as nothing more than a handsome straight man. He later admitted that the silence between laughs hurt worse than any punch he had taken in the boxing ring. In 1954, the wound became public humiliation. Look magazine cropped Dean from a cover photo, leaving Jerry smiling alone. "It felt like I had been erased from my own life," Dean told a friend. Even children shouting, "Where's Jerry?" at his shows cut him deeply. What looked like destiny had become a cage of laughter, and Dean endured it with a smile that hid his pain. On July 25, 1956, exactly 10 years after their debut, the partnership ended at the Copacabana. The ovation roared like thunder, but Dean later described it as a marriage without love, finally ended. The applause sounded like mourning, and the freedom it gave came with scars no curtain call could heal. Solo success and continuing struggles. When Dean stepped into the spotlight alone, the world doubted him. His first solo film, 10,000 Bedrooms in 1957, failed so completely that he later said it felt like every rejection of my childhood come back at once. Critics sneered, fans drifted away, and whispers grew that he was nothing without Jerry. But Dean was not made to surrender. In 1958, he stunned Hollywood in The Young Lions, holding his ground beside Marlon Brando and Montgomery Clift in a performance so powerful it forced critics to respect him at last. That same year, he released Volare. In 1964, he struck with thunder when Everybody Loves Somebody soared to number 1, knocking the Beatles off the charts at the height of Beatlemania. The man once dismissed as a sidekick now stood taller than the greatest band on earth. With Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Joey Bishop, and Peter Lawford, he formed the Rat Pack and turned Las Vegas Nights into legend. Yet even at his peak, the old wound whispered. Behind the easy grin and the glass in his hand, Dean wondered if he was truly loved for his talent or only adored for the mask he had learned to wear too well. Television fame and personal isolation. By 1965, Dean carried that question onto television. The Dean Martin Show premiered on NBC, and for 9 years and more than 260 episodes, he ruled with a style only he could manage. He refused rehearsals, arriving only for taping with a glass in hand and a smile on his lips. What looked like carelessness was actually genius. His quick wit was sharp, his charm effortless, his humor so natural it felt like he was speaking directly to each viewer. America adored the lovable drunk character, believing every wink and stumble was real. Few knew the truth. The glass often held apple juice, and behind the mask lived a man who valued family dinners and quiet goes, left afternoons more than endless parties. Yet the myth became so powerful it threatened to swallow him whole. Tabloids whispered of addiction, critics dismissed him as unserious, and Dean once told a friend, "The man America laughs with is not the man I see in the mirror." When the Dean Martin Show ended in 1974, he returned as host of the Dean Martin Celebrity Roasts, where Hollywood's biggest names gathered to mock and celebrate under his watchful grin. For a decade, the roasts became a national ritual with Dean at the center, king among friends. But even as laughter rolled on, the contradiction endured. America loved the mask, while the man behind it stood in solitude. Love, marriage, and family. Dean's personal life told a different story than his public success, one marked by love that couldn't quite survive the demands of fame. In 1941, at just 24, he married Elizabeth Betty McDonald when he was still Dino Crochet, a struggling singer with more debts than dollars. Betty didn't marry fame because there was none to be had. She married the quiet charm of a man who seemed destined for something beyond smoky clubs. Their early years were humble, marked by rented apartments, late bills, and dreams always just out of reach. Betty gave him 4 children, Craig, Claudia, Gail, and Diana, filling their modest home with laughter that shielded them from audiences who barely noticed Dean. For a time, it felt like love itself might be enough. But as Dean's star began to rise in the mid-1940s, the same applause that lifted him began to drown Betty out. She found herself married not to Dino the dreamer, but to Dean Martin the entertainer that the world demanded. The more the spotlight embraced him, the more it abandoned her. By 1949, as Dean and Jerry conquered Hollywood, the marriage crumbled. Dean walked away with custody of their 4 children, while Betty drifted into obscurity and declining health. In 1949, Dean married Jean Beager, a beautiful former Orange Bowl queen whose elegance and warmth seemed to steady him. For nearly 25 years, Jean was his constant companion, walking red carpets and standing beside him at Hollywood events while the world screamed his name. She gave him 3 more children, Dean Paul in 1951, Ricci in 1953, and Gina in 1956. Dean Paul became especially precious to his father. Dean would come home after long nights in clubs or marathon filming sessions and sit on the edge of Dean Paul's bed, listening to the boy talk about tennis or music, smiling as if the world had stopped spinning. "That kid's got it all," Dean would tell friends, half joking, half in awe. In those rare domestic moments, stripped of the spotlight, he seemed happiest. But even the strongest love bends under the relentless weight of fame. Jane had fallen in love with Dino Crochet, the dreamer still fighting to be heard. But she woke up each morning beside Dean Martin, the legend claimed by the public. Night after night, she stood in glittering gowns at his side, smiling through receptions and fancy dinners. Yet inside, she fought a battle she could never win, competing with millions of strangers for her husband's heart. By the early 1970s, unspoken resentments, endless separations, and quiet tears had hollowed out their marriage's foundation. In 1973, after 24 years that had once seemed unbreakable, their marriage finally ended. The news stunned Hollywood. For Dean, the divorce was not only the loss of a wife, but the shattering of the one place where he believed he could remove the mask of cool and simply exist as a husband and father. In 1973, Dean married Catherine Hahn, a stunning 26-year-old receptionist whose youth seemed to promise him a chance to start over. Catherine brought a daughter, Sasha, whom Dean quickly adopted as his own. For a time, they played at domestic peace with dinners in Beverly Hills and charity appearances. But lifestyle differences proved unforgiving. Less than 3 years later, in 1976, the marriage ended in divorce. Though brief, the relationship left Dean with another lasting bond. He continued treating Sasha as his daughter long after the papers were signed. The greatest tragedy. For all the heartbreaks Dean had endured, nothing cut deeper than the moment fate reached into his family and tore away the brightest light of his life, his beloved son, Dean Paul. To the world, Dean was the king of cool. But to his children, he was simply Dad. Among them, Dean Paul seemed to reflect his father's very spirit. Dean often told friends, "That boy is the best part of me." And when he said it, his eyes would shine in a way no spotlight ever could. Unlike his father, Dean Paul wasn't confined to a single gift. He sang with pop bands, played professional tennis, charmed Hollywood in films, and finally embraced the skies as a pilot, as if destiny itself couldn't contain his restless energy. For Dean, every achievement was a quiet triumph, every headline about his son worth more than any review about himself. That dream ended on March 21st, 1987. That morning, Captain Dean Paul Martin climbed into the cockpit of his F-4C Phantom jet for what should have been a routine training mission over the California desert. The weather was poor, and clouds were heavy, but nothing suggested catastrophe. Yet somewhere over the San Bernardino Mountains, radar contact vanished. In a single breath, silence swallowed the sky, and with it, the son both Dean and Jean had adored for 35 years. When the phone call reached Beverly Hills, witnesses said Dean's face seemed to age a decade instantly. The search became a vigil that gripped the nation. President Ronald Reagan, a personal friend, ordered advanced reconnaissance, sans planes to aid in the hunt. For 3 endless days, helicopters combed the mountains while Dean sat at home, chain-smoking, pacing, answering every phone ring with trembling hands. Day 1 brought optimism. Day 2 brought exhaustion. Day 3 brought only dread. Dean even turned to psychics in desperation, clutching at shadows as if the universe might still grant him a miracle. But the miracle never came. On the slopes of Mount San Gorgonio, searchers found the wreckage. There were no survivors. At 35 years old, Dean Paul Martin was gone. Those closest to Dean said he never recovered. He was broken, a friend recalled. Even Sinatra, who had seen him through decades of highs and lows, admitted Dean was never the same man again. The shrug, the smile, the effortless cool that had carried him through rejection and betrayal could not protect him now. Sinatra, desperate to help, convinced Dean to join a reunion tour with himself and Sammy Davis Jr., hoping the roar of crowds might reignite his spark. But Dean stood before thousands and felt only emptiness. After one performance in New York, while Sinatra and Davis planned to celebrate, Dean quietly boarded a jet home, leaving the tour behind. The stage that had once given him everything now mocked him with its noise, unable to fill the silence his son had left. Final years and death. Though he had survived heartbreaks that would have broken most men, Dean Martin could not escape the cruel weight of time. In 1993, at 76, doctors confirmed what his body already knew. Years of relentless smoking had taken their toll, and lung cancer had begun its quiet assault. Every breath grew heavier, as if the very air was abandoning him. The doctors urged surgery, but Dean refused. No hospitals, no machines, no sterile rooms stealing away the little dignity he had left. "I just want peace," he told his children softly. His daughter Deana later remembered those words as the most heartbreaking and the most noble thing I ever heard from him. From that moment, he withdrew from the bright stages that had defined him and chose instead the stillness of his Beverly Hills home. Dean spent slow afternoons on the golf course and long evenings lost in old westerns, their black and white heroes reminding him of days when life seemed simpler. Deana became his anchor in those final years. "He smiled for us, the same smile America knew," she wrote. "But I could see the pain behind it." She recalled how he lingered when holding her hand, as if afraid to let go, and how he asked her to sit beside him while westerns flickered across the screen. Sometimes she sang quietly to him the very songs that had once made him immortal. His favorite was "Everybody Loves Somebody." "When I sang it," Deana remembered, "he closed his eyes, and for a moment I could almost see him back on stage." On Christmas Day, December 25th, 1995, while the world outside was alive with bells and laughter, Dean Martin's house was wrapped in silence. Inside, the King of Cool sat not on a stage but in his armchair, frail, his breath shallow, his once magnetic presence reduced to quiet gestures. Around him gathered only a few loved ones, clinging to him as if their nearness might hold back the inevitable. That morning, Deana took her place at his side. She held his hand and felt how fragile it had become. Wanting to give him comfort, she began to sing "Everybody Loves Somebody." Her voice wavered, but the melody filled the room like a prayer. When he closed his eyes, she later wrote, I wanted to believe he was resting, but I knew in my heart that he was saying goodbye. That afternoon, at 78, Dean Martin drew his last breath from acute respiratory failure. Outside, families celebrated Christmas with joy. Inside, a daughter carried the memory of watching her father slip away as her song still echoed in the air. 3 days later, Las Vegas dimmed its neon lights in tribute. The city that had once pulsed with his VO. Ice stood in solemn darkness, bowing to the man who had defined its golden age. For a brief, haunting moment, even the desert of lights surrendered to silence, honoring the legend it had once crowned. Legacy. Dean Martin's legacy refused to die with him. His estate, valued at nearly $30 million, was carefully protected through the Dean Martin Family Trust, ensuring that royalties from his films, television appearances, and recordings would remain under his family's control. It was more than financial planning. It was an act of love, shielding his family from exploitation of an image he could no longer defend. His daughter Deana became the living flame of his memory. A performer herself, she toured the world singing her father's greatest hits, not as imitation but as devotion, telling stories between verses that let audiences glimpse the man behind the tuxedo. In her memoir, Memories Are Made of This, she unveiled Dean not as the king of cool, but as the gentle father who made pancakes on Sundays and held her hand a little longer than necessary. Each year, Deana returns to Steubenville, Ohio to host the Dean Martin Festival, where scholarships are given in his name, ensuring that the boy who once dropped out of school in shame now inspires education and artistry in children who dream. Dean Martin left behind more than millions, mansions, and music rights. His real fortune lies in the warmth of a style that made strangers feel like friends, in laughter that made loneliness bearable, and in a voice that still croons across decades, reminding us that everybody loves somebody sometime. His legacy is not just a catalog of songs but a way of living, quiet dignity in the face of heartbreak and love so enduring that even death could not silence it. Nearly 30 years after he slipped into eternity, Dean Martin remains not just a man remembered but a presence felt, a song still playing in the hearts of millions who continue to love somebody just like he taught them to do.